Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. It's strange how you can look back on your life and pinpoint the exact moment everything started to unravel. My life with Jenna was almost too perfect at first. She was the kind of woman who lit up any room she entered, her laughter and easy charm turning strangers into friends within minutes. I always felt lucky around her, like I had somehow pulled off the ultimate feat by marrying her. We settled into a comfortable rhythm, and over the years, I grew to think of our life as unbreakable. Our relationship began with spontaneity, adventures, and late nights talking about dreams, regrets, and everything in between. I believed we had built a love that was untouchable, a fortress that no one could breach. Together, we faced career ups and downs, family issues, and our own share of personal challenges. She was my rock, and I wanted to be hers. The idea of her betraying me felt like something so distant it was impossible, a worry only paranoid people entertained. Little did I know, trust can be as fragile as glass, shattering with the slightest impact when you least expect it. Then, about 6 months ago, Jenna started coming home later than usual. At first, I barely noticed. We both had busy lives, and sometimes she'd need to stay late at work or catch up with friends. I'd pass the time catching up on emails, reading, or watching whatever random show was on TV, never doubting her reasons. But over time, I started noticing little changes. She became more secretive, more protective of her phone, and seemed distracted even when we were together. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly now felt forced, as if she was always holding something back. One Friday night, she came home unusually late, claiming she'd been catching up with an old friend. It wasn't the first time she'd come home late, but that night was different. I was already in bed, half asleep when I heard her keys jingling as she fumbled with the lock. When she finally stepped inside, I could smell the faint scent of a perfume I didn't recognize clinging to her clothes. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overreacting. But when she kissed me goodnight, the warmth that usually filled me felt tainted by the cold ache of suspicion. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 questions I didn't want to answer. The following morning, I tried to shake off the feeling. I'd always been someone who valued trust above all else, and I didn't want to let my imagination ruin everything Jenna and I had built together. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt. That day, I decided to check our phone bill online, something I rarely did. I told myself it was just to ease my mind, to prove to myself that I was being paranoid. But what I found only deepened the pit in my stomach. A number I didn't recognize appeared repeatedly on her call log, especially at odd hours. Sometimes she'd call it late at night, sometimes during the day, and it was always brief but frequent. I jotted down the number, wondering if it belonged to someone she worked with. I tried to convince myself it was harmless, but a seed of doubt had already taken root. Once it's there, doubt doesn't just sit quietly. It grows, twisting and winding through your mind until it consumes everything else. That night, I tried to ask Jenna about her day, hoping I could find some hint of reassurance in her answer. She was unusually quiet, her responses short and vague. I watched her closely, noting every shift in her expression, every nervous glance away from my gaze. When she went to bed, I stayed up, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the spiral of thoughts running through my head. But it was no use. Sleep wouldn't come, and when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with a tangled mess of half-formed suspicions and questions I didn't want answered. Over the next few days, I tried to keep things normal. I wanted to believe that this was all just some misunderstanding, that everything would go back to the way it was. But the signs only became harder to ignore. Jenna's absences grew more frequent, and she'd become defensive any time I asked about her plans. One evening, she told me she was meeting up with some friends from college. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but as soon as she left, I found myself grabbing my car keys and heading out the door. I trailed her from a distance, my heart pounding as I watched her car wind through the city streets. I was ashamed of myself for doing this, but I needed to know the truth. We'd promised each other honesty when we got married, and now that promise was slipping through my fingers. Jenna's car eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe I'd never been to. I parked a few spots away, watching as she got out of the car, smoothed her dress, and glanced around. A man was waiting for her by the entrance, a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a casual but put-together way, the kind of guy who looked like he didn't have to try too hard to impress. They exchanged a hug that lingered a moment too long, and then he opened the door for her, ushering her inside. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. In that moment, I felt like I'd fallen into some nightmare, the kind that leaves you gasping for air as you struggle to wake up. But this was no dream. This was my life. I watched them through the cafe's large windows as they settled into a booth, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see the way she looked at him, her eyes bright with a warmth she hadn't shown me in months. It was a look I remembered well, a look she used to save for me. The next morning, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Jenna moved around the kitchen as if nothing had changed, humming softly while she made coffee and prepped breakfast. Her usual routine, her calm demeanor, it all seemed so normal. But I couldn't shake the image of her with that man, couldn't stop replaying the way she'd looked at him across the table, leaning in close, laughing at something he'd said. I went through the motions of the day, barely aware of what I was doing. Jenna chatted about her plans for the weekend, mentioned a work event she needed to attend, but I didn't really hear her. My mind was locked onto a single question, a relentless, gnawing thought: how long had she been lying to me? As she walked out the door that morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for answers anymore. I needed to know the truth, and I would find it, no matter what. That evening, I couldn't bring myself to confront her directly. Instead, I decided to start by gathering what I could on my own. I began with her phone, which she usually kept close by. But tonight, she had left it in the kitchen while she took a shower. Heart pounding, I picked it up, hands trembling slightly as I unlocked it. I scrolled through her recent messages, feeling a mixture of dread and anger. Most of her texts were with friends, family, the usual group chats. But when I searched for the unknown number, there it was, a series of messages with a contact saved as M. The texts were brief, casual, but there was an intimacy in them, a familiarity that set my teeth on edge. I went deeper, scrolling through weeks of texts. There were inside jokes I didn't recognize, vague references to meetings and plans, moments shared that I hadn't been a part of. They spoke in code, but it was clear enough what they were doing. The words alone felt like punches to my gut. The worst was seeing her send him goodnight messages, small moments of tenderness she used to share only with me. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone, but I kept going, driven by a need to know the full extent of her betrayal. As I set the phone down, the bathroom door opened, and Jenna stepped out, her hair damp, dressed in her usual pajama pants and one of my old shirts. She flashed me a quick smile as she walked past, her expression completely innocent, as if she hadn't just spent hours texting someone else, laughing, sharing secrets. For a moment, I considered confronting her right then, but something held me back. I wanted more than an argument. I wanted the truth. The next few days, I kept up the act. I'd watch her whenever she wasn't looking, analyzing every gesture, every word, trying to find cracks in her story. She was good at pretending, though. I could see now that she'd been doing it for months, maybe even years. In the meantime, I started digging into her phone records and credit card statements. Every evening after she fell asleep, I'd comb through the details, piecing together fragments of her other life. The more I found, the angrier I became, but I kept my emotions in check. I needed to be calm, collected, to see this through without tipping her off. One evening, as she was out again, I went a step further. I'd found a message about a recent hotel booking, and with a quick search, I managed to locate the place. I sat there for a long time, staring at the name on my screen. All it would take was a quick drive. I could go there, catch them in the act, put an end to this deception once and for all. But some part of me resisted. I wasn't ready to face the truth head-on just yet. Instead, I decided to gather as much proof as I could, to confront her only when I was absolutely certain. That night, I hired a private investigator, someone discreet, who assured me he'd get to the bottom of things. It felt strange, taking such drastic measures, but at this point, I needed an outside perspective. I'd been so close to Jenna for so long that I couldn't fully trust my own judgment. Every time she walked through the door with that same carefree smile, I felt my resolve weaken, a small part of me still hoping it was all a mistake. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen too much already to go back. The next week was a blur. I went through each day in a daze, consumed by the investigation. The private investigator worked quickly, sending me photos, timestamps, records of Jenna's whereabouts. It was all there, laid out in cold, undeniable detail. She'd been meeting her lover in various places, cafes, parks, hotels, careful to keep things low-key, but not careful enough. He was a coworker, someone she'd mentioned in passing a few times, a name I hadn't paid much attention to. And now, that name was burned into my mind. One evening, as I went through the latest batch of photos, my phone buzzed with a new message from the investigator: "She's at the hotel now. Room 204. My hands shook as I read the message, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. I knew what I had to do. I had to see it for myself, to face the reality I'd been trying so hard to ignore. I grabbed my keys, barely aware of the drive as I sped toward the hotel. My mind was a storm of emotions, but underneath it all was a cold determination. I parked across the street, my heart pounding as I stared up at the building. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to walk away and pretend none of this was happening. But I pushed those thoughts aside and made my way inside. The hotel lobby was quiet, dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. I felt out of place, like I didn't belong in this world she'd created behind my back. The receptionist gave me a polite nod as I walked past, and I forced myself to keep moving, focusing only on the room number. I reached the door of room 204 and stood there, my hand hovering over the door, unsure of what to do. My heart was racing, and my stomach churned as I imagined what was happening on the other side. Part of me wanted to burst in, to catch them in the act, to finally put an end to this nightmare. But as I stood there, something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was denial. All I knew was that I couldn't bring myself to open that door. Instead, I turned and walked back down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Back in my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, heart still pounding as the reality of what I had just done, or rather, what I couldn't bring myself to do, settled over me. I had driven all the way to the hotel, stood at the door where I knew Jenna was betraying me, but I hadn't had the strength to confront her face to face. As much as I wanted to end this nightmare, as much as I wanted to see the truth in all its painful clarity, some part of me still wasn't ready to accept it. When I got home, I poured myself a drink, then another, hoping it would numb the ache inside me. It didn't. I stayed up all night, watching the shadows stretch across the room, my mind filled with images of Jenna and that man, of every lie she'd told, every moment we'd shared that now felt tainted. But eventually, as the sun rose, my sadness turned to something else: resolve. I wouldn't avoid the truth any longer. I would confront her, but I would do it on my terms, with all the cards in my hand. For the next few days, I carefully crafted my plan. I would confront Jenna not with wild accusations or a desperate plea for honesty but with the undeniable evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I wanted to see the look on her face when she realized there was no escaping this, that I knew everything. The day finally arrived. Jenna was coming home early that evening, so I set the stage. I printed out the photos from the investigator, a timeline of her texts with him, and credit card records from their hotel stays. I arranged everything on the dining room table, a stark testament to her betrayal. Then, I sat down and waited. When I heard her car pull into the driveway, my heart skipped a beat, but I stayed calm. She walked in, glancing at me with a quick smile as she set her bag down on the counter. But when she saw the document spread across the table, her face froze, her eyes darting over the evidence laid out before her. "Michael, what is this?" she stammered, her voice trembling. I looked up at her, my expression calm but unyielding. "It's the truth, Jenna. The truth you've been hiding from me for months." She took a step back, her hand covering her mouth as she scanned the evidence, her face growing paler with each passing second. I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I know about him. I know about the hotels, the messages, the work dinners that were anything but work. I know everything, Jenna." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it, that she would try to twist the truth or throw some excuse my way. But instead, she simply looked down, the fight leaving her. "Michael, I don't know what to say." "Start with why," I replied, my voice steady. "After all these years, after everything we've been through, why did you do it?" She took a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on the floor. I don't know. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant to hurt you." "Then what did you mean to do, Jenna?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That you could just carry on with him behind my back forever?" Her silence was answer enough. She stood there, looking so small and lost, but I felt no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. The woman standing before me wasn't the same Jenna I had married. This woman was a stranger. "It just happened," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't plan for it. I thought it was just going to be a distraction. But then it got out of hand, and I didn't know how to stop." "A distraction?" I repeated, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You destroyed our marriage for a distraction?" She flinched at my words, but she didn't look up. "I'm sorry, Michael. I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" I shook my head in disbelief. "You're sorry now that you're caught. But what if I hadn't found out? Would you still be sorry? Or would you still be meeting him, lying to me, pretending like nothing was wrong?" She said nothing, her silence answering the question for her. I could see the guilt etched on her face, but it wasn't enough. Nothing she could say or do now could ever make up for the months of betrayal, the countless lies she had fed me while carrying on with another man. "I trusted you, Jenna," I continued, my voice choked with emotion. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? With lies and deceit?" Tears began streaming down her face, and she finally looked up, her eyes pleading. "Michael, please. I know I made a mistake, but I love you. I want to fix this, to make things right." I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix this? You think you can just apologize and we'll go back to the way things were? There's no fixing this, Jenna. You broke something that can't be mended." She stepped toward me, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled back. "Please, Michael. I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything. Just, please, give me a chance." Her words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to hold on to the life she had so carelessly thrown away. But I couldn't bring myself to feel anything but anger and hurt. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. "You should have thought about that before," I said coldly. "Before you lied to me, before you betrayed me, before you turned our life into a joke." Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was the woman I had loved, the woman I had built my life around, and now she was nothing but a stranger to me. After a few moments, she looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Is there really no way we can fix this? I'll do whatever it takes, Michael. I'll go to therapy, I'll quit my job, anything. Just please, don't throw it all away. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. I had already made my decision. This isn't something that can be fixed with a few therapy sessions or a new job, Jenna. You broke my trust, and without that, there's nothing left between us. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, her sobs echoing through the quiet room. I stood there, watching her, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But I knew that would be a lie. Nothing would ever be okay again. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to say next. I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while. We both need some space. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. Michael, no. Please. Don't do this. I can't. I can't lose you. You already have, I replied, my voice cold and distant. You lost me the moment you decided to betray me. She sat there, stunned, as the reality of my words sank in. I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight I had been carrying for months had finally been lifted. It was over. There was no going back. As I turned to leave the room, Jenna reached out, her voice breaking. Michael, please. I love you. But I didn't look back. I walked away, her sobs echoing behind me, each step taking me further from the life I had once known, the life that had been shattered beyond repair. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew that, for better or worse, I was finally free. Weeks passed, and with Jenna gone, the house felt empty but oddly peaceful. The first few days after she left, I'd expected some kind of relief, a sense of freedom. Instead, there was only an aching void, a silence that gnawed at me. I told myself it would pass, that I'd get used to this new life. But the longer I spent alone, the more I realized that, even after everything, a part of me missed her. Every day, I went through the motions, but my heart wasn't in it. I still hadn't decided whether to file for divorce or try to start fresh. Part of me knew that reconciliation was impossible, that trust was the foundation of any relationship, and ours was shattered beyond repair. But still, a small part of me, the part that remembered the early days of our marriage, wondered if there was something worth salvaging. Then, one day, I received a message from Jenna, please meet me tonight at our spot. I have something important to tell you. Our spot. It was where we'd had our first date, where I'd proposed, where we'd spent countless evenings together, talking about our dreams and planning our life. She hadn't contacted me since she'd left, and the message felt like a jolt to my system. I wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward without looking back, but curiosity, and maybe a flicker of hope, got the better of me. That evening, I found myself driving to the spot by the lake, the place that had once been our sanctuary. The sky was overcast, the water dark and rippling under the low-hanging clouds. I parked and sat in my car for a moment, wondering if this was a mistake, if I was setting myself up for more pain. But as I sat there, I saw her car pull up beside mine. Jenna got out, looking tired and worn. Her face was paler than usual, her eyes dull, as though she hadn't slept in days. She looked like a different person, a shadow of the woman I'd once loved. Part of me wanted to turn away, but I got out and walked over to her, waiting in silence as she searched for the right words. Thank you for meeting me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, folding my arms. You said you had something important to tell me. She took a deep breath, looking down at the ground. Michael. I know what I did was unforgivable, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But there's something you don't know. Something that I haven't told anyone. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. What is it? She hesitated, her face contorting as she struggled to hold back tears. The affair wasn't. It wasn't what you think. It wasn't about you, or even about him. It was about me. She looked up, meeting my eyes with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. There's something I've been hiding from you for a long time, something I've been running from. I waited, my heart pounding, unsure of what she was about to reveal. I was diagnosed with cancer a year ago, she said softly. Her voice wavered, and she closed her eyes, struggling to hold herself together. They found it during a routine checkup. It was advanced, too late to operate. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me that way. The words hit me like a blow to the chest. Cancer. Jenna was sick, sicker than I could have imagined. My mind reeled as I tried to process what she was telling me, but before I could speak, she continued. I was terrified, Michael, she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. I couldn't bear the thought of you watching me waste away, of being a burden to you. So I made the decision to keep it a secret. I thought if I pushed you away, it would be easier. That you'd hate me, move on, maybe even find happiness again. Her words cut through me, each one like a blade. She had betrayed me, not out of selfishness or desire, but out of a twisted sense of love, a desperate attempt to shield me from the pain she was going through. My anger, the resentment I'd carried for weeks, faded, replaced by a hollow ache. Why didn't you just tell me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why didn't you let me be there for you? She looked at me with a sorrowful smile. I thought it would be better if you hated me. I thought it would be easier that way. She paused, wiping her tears. I made a mess of everything, I know that. But please, Michael, understand that I did it because I didn't want you to go through the pain I was facing. I thought pushing you away would be the kindest thing. I felt a deep sadness well up inside me, an ache that I couldn't suppress. I thought back to all the little moments that had led us to this point, the suspicions, the fights, the betrayal, and now this, the truth, raw and painful, cutting deeper than any lie. What about him? I managed to ask, my voice shaky. The man you were seeing, was he real? She looked away, ashamed. He was just someone I thought would help me make it easier, someone to make me feel alive when I felt like I was dying inside. But it wasn't real. None of it was real. I pushed you away, I lied, I did terrible things, but it was all to protect you from this. The weight of her confession hung between us, a sorrow so profound it was suffocating. I wanted to reach out, to hold her, but part of me couldn't move. I was caught between the past and the present, torn between the love I had once felt and the bitterness that had replaced it. Jenna took a shaky breath, her face a mask of exhaustion and regret. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Michael. I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know the truth, to understand why I did what I did. I didn't want to die with you thinking I didn't love you. I looked at her, my heart heavy with a mixture of grief and pity. I realized that, despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, I still cared for her. I still loved her, even if I didn't fully understand why. The woman standing before me was broken, but so was I. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal. After a long silence, I reached out, taking her hand in mine. Jenna. I don't know if I can forgive you. But I know I don't want you to go through this alone. She looked up, her eyes filled with surprise, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimmer of hope. I didn't know what the future held for us or if we could ever rebuild what had been shattered. But in that moment, I knew one thing, whatever happened, we would face it together.